Sont, recherche, sciences,
mathématiques,
théorie,
physique, philosophie,
conférences, archéologie,
nature.
Chers collègues, cher Henri Leridon,
Dear colleagues,
aujourd'hui la chaire de développement
you
durable,
now occupy the chair for sustainable development, a new annual chair at the Collège de France, a chair that was created to answer a question that we've all been asking ourselves as regards possibilities on our planet to ensure for future generations the quality of life such as we know it. Sustainable development, therefore, requires us to take into account complex parameters in many different areas, the environment, energy, or societal. A cross view by researchers, engineers, and specialists in exact and social sciences is therefore necessary. Thanks to a first-rank expert at international level, this chair will allow us to cover over 5 years the major issues in sustainable development, economics, changes in the climate, and impact on health and the economy, the impact of human activities on water, carbon, biodiversity, and energy in the future. These lessons, with an international ambition, could not have come about without support from Total, whose partnership for creating this chair made it possible to organize international symposia, providing to the greatest number education via the internet and with interpretation in English of these lessons. This inaugural lesson is being broadcast live, as a matter of fact, on several campuses in the French-speaking universities, with a video conference that will make it possible to answer questions raised by development players on the spot. Demographics comes at an early stage in research on sustainable development. It is literally at the heart of the economic and ecological issues we're facing today. It was logical for the first year of this chair to be devoted to this issue, and the Collège de France could not have done anything better than to choose you, dear Henri, as the first holder of this chair. After training at the Polytechnical School, followed by a doctorate in economic sciences in Paris, you were head of the Department of Social Demographics at the National Institute of Demographic Studies, INED, in charge of research at that same institute. And until recently, you were director of a mixed research institute, INSERN, INED, referred to as epidemiology, demographics, and social sciences. Your first works were on the analysis of fertility in human populations. You focused on many different issues of contraception in different societies regarding fecundity, family demographics, and population dynamics. Amongst other things, you analyzed the gap that can exist between the start of the drop in mortality and the decline in birth rate, leading to a quick demographic growth, which is characteristic of demographic transition. Your research on variations in fecundity have led you to explore changes in structure and family standards, a change with respect to what is considered as a safe value in difficult times, namely the family. All of your contributions perfectly illustrate the need for a multidisciplinary approach to deal with these complex issues, and we rely on you to shed light on us. Thank you. Mr. Directors, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends further afield, exactly 40 years ago, Humanity experienced a unique and decisive event in its history. I'm not referring to man's first steps on the moon in 1969 or to socio-political movements in 1968, but the fact that the growth rate of the world population moved to a level that was never before attained, 2% per year, before declining rapidly. It took several years to realize that a maximum, a peak, had been reached. Until then, it was the increase in growth rate that was focused on, with world population evolving at the rhythm of an exponential. This chart, partly borrowed from Jean-Noël Birabin, demographer and historian, shows possible evolution in the world population over 2,000 years, on a scale of 0 to 2,000. This logarithmic scale, and yet growth has been exponential for at least 400 years. Trends in recent decades can hardly be seen at this scale. On this chart, covering only the past 100 years in blue, with a projection over 50 years. This time is an ordinary and not a logarithmic scale, and we can see the slowdown in the past 40 years, with growth appearing linear over this period before declining probably in the next decades. It's an inflection, therefore, on a curve that continues to grow. World population has not started to decline. For that, growth rate will have to be negative. And here is the growth rate on the scale of 150 years, the last 50 years, and the next 100 years. This time the peak is clearly visible and the decrease is apparent. The rate was halved in 50 years, showing a reduction that was higher than the increase over the past 50 years, which means that we can reach zero before the end of the current century. These figures were published by the United Nations Population Division, founded in 1946, proposing estimations on population in the various countries around the world and carrying out regular forecasts. It also made it possible to carry out surveys in countries that had no such surveys, so as to fine-tune estimates on world population. Without being perfect, these evaluations are far better quality than before the Second World War, and the reality of a growth peak at around 1960 can no longer be truly challenged. But what can allow us to assert that a rate of 2% has not already been achieved in the past? These are the great laws of demographics, laws that were set up primarily between 1920 and 1960. Let's start with the simplest part. In a closed population without exchanges with other populations, which is the case of the world population after all, the growth rate is equal to the difference between the birth and mortality rate. It's therefore a matter of determining what can be the levels of birth rate and mortality in past populations. To answer that question, you would need to have reasonable, reliable statistics on these populations or use estimates based in particular on biological basis or a mix of both. There's one man who more than any other made a major contribution, the French demographer Louis Henri. His name doesn't mean much to many of you, but for many he's the greatest French demographer and one of the greatest in the world. In the 60s, Louis Henri, he launched a major project to reconstitute trends in the French population since the 17th century, developing innovative methods in historical demography and at the same time proposed mathematical models so as to study human reproduction. Having had the chance of working by his side, I was able to show him a great interest in this latter field. Let us move to the second point. The ideas on maximum biological capacity have often been erroneous, and many people get it wrong still. Not to get anyone vexed, but let's, for example, quote the terms used by the war studies expert Gaston Boutoul in 1958. I quote, "Without this intervention, namely for Great Britain, the regulation exercised by societies on marriage and on sexual relations, without that, therefore, between the age of 15 and 45, every woman would have a child per year. Just add up. That would mean 30 children per woman on the average. There are two errors. That means believing that children are born at an interval of 1 year and that all women are fertile from 15 to 45. Louis Henri's models, based on precise observations of the various components of reproduction and on their rigorous combination, models that I continue to work on through other means, these show that in a population without birth control and where women would be married between the age of 15 and would stay in a couple until the age of 45, we'd only have 10 children per woman, especially because of breastfeeding, for example, which helps to reduce births. This, as a matter of fact, level has very rarely been reached in real populations because it's rare for every woman to get married as of the age of 15 and to stay married up to the age of 45. In terms of mortality, we have an idea of life expectancy in older populations. When you look at Eastern European populations, in the 18th century, for example, we can estimate life expectancy based on the spread of age at the time of decease. This can be known through the civil status or through the parish registers in older times. Average life expectancy in ordinary periods, in other words, without any natural or social cataclysm, would generally stand at about 25 years. Now, based on these estimations, probable maximum figures for fecundity and life expectancy, we can use this to work on the theory of stable populations developed by Alfred Ludger between 1907 and 1939 to deduce from this that the population growth rate. And we realize that the range in possible values stands at between 0 and 1%. Below 0, the population decreases and finishes by disappear. A few words about Alfred Ludger. He published his first articles in 1907 and 1911, followed by the work Element of Physical Biology in 1925, and finally the Analytical Theory of Biological Associations in 1934 and 1939. In his work in 1925, he posed equations so as to track the evolution of two competing species in a single environment, the predator-prey model, which is then thereafter known as the Ludger-Volterra equations. Ludger therefore considered that human species would take part in a broader ecological system. He was a member of the Ecological Society of America as of 1925, as a matter of fact. And demographers have somewhat overlooked this dimension of his work. Another reason to point out that recent demographic trends are unprecedented is that we know the mechanism. In almost all societies, mortality has declined without the same happening for birth rates. This is the process of the demographic transition, which I will teach in the coming weeks. To sum up briefly, the world population's growth in the second half of the 20th century from 2.5 to 6 billion inhabitants is due to progress and economic development in the most developed countries today, which exported to less advanced countries a part of their success in the fight against death. In these latter countries, the decline in fecundity lagged behind. It has just started in a part of Africa. The time lag between mortality and birth rates led to a strong demographic growth and led to a peak in the 60s. But clearly, 3% growth rates per year, as we can see in the past and still today in some countries, are not just accidents of history that are unsustainable. You should recall that at this rhythm, the population would double every 23 years in less than a generation. Birth control by couples has become an absolute necessity, a direct consequence of the drop in mortality. The benchmark of 8 children in a country in Africa or elsewhere, thinking that this can be perpetuated, that's truly wrong. The grandmother may have given birth 8 times, but never did the family really have 8 children because 1/4 of them died before 1 year, and only 40% would still be alive at the age of 20. Whereas the life expectancy today of 55 years, that means that 6 of the 8 children would become 20. It is regrettable that some political or religious persons, including at the Vatican, have still not taken into account this clear trend which is irreversible, and that they're still against the use of birth control systems, even in wedlock. So the world's population trends over the past 100 years has therefore been truly exceptional. In absolute terms, growth can be seen as being even more worrying. Our Earth counted 75 million inhabitants more each year from 1970 to 1990, and these figures are dropping every year. For a continent like Africa, with the current record, the population will move from 800 million to 2 billion in 50 years' time after having doubled in 25 years, leading to concerns that appeared in the 50s and in the following decade, and it should take on a new turn with the publication in 1968 of the work called The Population Bomb by the entomologist Paul Ehrlich and his wife Anne, and led to global discussion with, in 1972, The Limits to Growth by Donella and Dennis Meadows. These two works placed at the heart of their reflection and their alarms demographic growth, considered as being unsustainable. They considered that the growth rate of the world population was declining at the time when they were publishing their work. And even if we take into account this changing trend, the thrust given to the global population would not finish producing its effects, and this brand new situation deserved careful thinking. These authors recommended, therefore, a halt in demographic growth, but also in economic growth. This last point was particularly surprising in a context where a strong world economy was considered rather positive. For example, looked at Jean Forestier from 1945 to 1976. He spoke of the 30 years of prosperity after World War II. And when we began to realize the need for the economic takeoff of all countries, that they started to call underdeveloped or developing. And yet, although these works have had a considerable echo, and although they have significantly helped to the organization of international conferences where the notion of sustainable development started to be spoken of, I'll come back to this, the idea of zero growth in the economy was never followed. It's this shift in the radical perspective from a halt in growth to a more realistic view of an acceptable growth that I will speak about. Dear colleagues, by setting up this chair, you have decided to focus the first year on demographics, and for having done me the honor of calling on me, I'd like to thank you personally, but also for having highlighted a minority discipline that is sometimes controversial, namely demographics. It is not the first time that the Collège de France has had demographics taught. Exactly 50 years ago, Alfred Sauvy inaugurated the social demographics chair, which he held for 11 years. Although Louis Henri, more than anyone else in France, helped to make demographics a truly scientific discipline, it will certainly not be what it is in our country today without Alfred Sauvy. His great clairvoyance, his obstination, his ability to choose men and women of great quality, his vast culture, his great knowledge of economic and social mechanisms, and his work in this brand new discipline, demography, allowed him to create in 1945 the National Institute of Demographic Studies and to develop it so well that more than 60 years later it is still the flagship of French demography, one of the 3 or 4 centers in Europe and a reference around the world for demographers. Alfred Sauvy, I'd like to point out, and this is an opinion that was expressed by a representative of the Ministry of the Budget, to justify that was the creation of the INED, and that a few jobs at the INED should be held by contractual staff members, in other words, fixed-term jobs, and not civil servants. INED overcame serious crises, but there's still a lot to be done on issues regarding population for INED to be able to continue to prove its worth. Mr. Administrator, I must point out a chance that the advisor of François I, Guillaume Budet, did not stand by his king when he invited him to create the Collège de France in 1530. Fortunately, he didn't say the same thing about civil servants as was done in 1945. So, clearly, demography is amongst the social sciences, but it is not now considered as the most quantitative of social sciences. the hardest of the soft sciences, setting aside economics. This is justified by the increasing use of many digital data and mathematical tools that are not exceedingly complex, but may scare off people with a literary training or sociologists who are not trained. So it's all about the art of combining and interpreting the various components of population development or trends. And mere good common sense or personal experience can truly be a trap in this field. And the fact that the themes covered by demography, birth, death, migration, marriage, can be very close to individual experience. Societal issues exposes the discipline to serious misunderstandings or controversy. These controversy may be healthy. Other issues are merely based on ideology, based on personal views. And here, the fact that demography belongs to social sciences exposes it to major risks. This is the case, at least in France, because elsewhere, the discussion on demography is far more serene. But let us come back to growth. Alfred Sauvy took part in this debate resolutely with respect to, against the idea of bringing economic growth to a halt. In a work called A Halt in Growth, he used words such as mystification, sorcery, witchcraft, morbid pessimism. As a matter of fact, René Dumont was challenged. René Dumont, the father of French ecology. Alfred Sauvy had at least one good reason for not believing that growth could come to a halt immediately. For him, as for other economists, economic growth should at least be adjusted to demographic growth. It had fine days ahead still, because as a good demographer, Sauvy knew that you couldn't stop population in full growth, just like you couldn't stop a locomotive in just a few meters. Jean Bourgeois-Pichat, who took over from Alfred Sauvy at INED, clearly showed this in 1970 in a review, Population, with calculation resources that were quite limited at the time. He took the example of Mexico, where the representative for the United States at the UN Population Commission wanted to stop demographic growth before the year 2000, within less than 40 years, as he wanted to do that for all fast-growing countries. To obtain such a result, if we were to admit that mortality would continue to decline, that means a very sharp decrease in fecundity. In the case of Mexico, it would have to move from nearly 7 children per woman to less than 1 in a single generation. At the age of 30 years, mothers would have 7 children, daughters 1. This, for many years, led to a lot of changes in fecundity, ups and downs, and an age structure that would be very difficult to manage. A more realistic objective would consist in bringing fecundity, the average number of children per woman, to just below 2. It's not about affecting the population before several years, bringing it to a level that will be higher, but it will be doing it in a more realistic fashion. As a matter of fact, this is the path that was followed by the Mexican population from 1970 to today. Regarding the population, it was therefore unrealistic to imagine in 1970 zero growth before several decades. In terms of the economy, most specialists at the time did not imagine bringing growth to a halt. What did the economic theories say about that? Let's revise our classics a bit, very briefly. Too quickly, actually. Of course, the concept of growth has always been at the theory of economic theory. But generally to talk about the conditions, terms and conditions, interactions with employment, savings, and investment, rather than to discuss its very principles and limits. The classic economists in the 18th and 19th century, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, have probed into this. They had a rather pessimistic vision of growth. The law of declining, or the fatal increase in the price of land and raw material due to scarcity, and the drop in profits considered as the drivers for growth, all of this together would mean that growth would only last for a period and the economies would move towards a flat. This prospect was not disastrous for most of its authors. The rest of history didn't prove them right. But the second of the third arguments, the rarity of cultivable land and commodities, it is now an issue once again. Malthus, with his famous essay on the principle of population, first published in 1798, gave a far more pessimistic version of the limits to growth, even though he attenuated his presentation later on. As we know, Malthus opposed geometric, spontaneous growth of the population to, at best, an arithmetic growth in food resources. The divergence would lead to a food crisis, an increase in mortality, and a sharp reduction in the population. To avoid this, individuals need to set up preventive restraints, moral constraints, delaying marriage, sexual abstinence in wedlock. But as history has shown, population can grow at an exponential rhythm. Malthus seriously underestimated the ability of agriculture to be more productive. Condorcet, just before that, experienced the same idea more or less. As Amartya Sen pointed out, Condorcet said that demographic growth could lead to a continuous decline in happiness and posed the foundation of a Malthusian scenario by contemplating an increasing number of men who would exceed their subsistence means. But Condorcet had confidence in progress for individuals to be able to spontaneously restrict fecundity. In 1973, he wrote, "There can therefore be a limit to the possible mass of subsistence, and therefore to the largest possible population, without this leading to this early destruction to be contrary to the nature and social prosperity of a part of those who have received life." We should note that growth indicator for this author wasn't the production or the level of life, but happiness. After all, Condorcet was not an economist. The debate opened by Malthus on the possibilities of a spontaneous change in behavior due to demographic pressure is still a burning topic. In the middle of the 19th century, Marx as well denied the possibility of unlimited growth. He used the third argument of the classics with respect to the tendential decline in profit rates to conclude that capitalism could not survive, and for the orthodox post-Marxists, the socialist system should replace capitalism and would be liberated of this constraint and should therefore not see any obstacle to growth. In the second half of the 19th century, we also saw the marginalist revolution bringing life to new tools for economic theory, especially with Gibbons, Menger, Walras, and Pareto. By focusing on microeconomic aspects with the subjective theories of value, marginal utility, and invention of Homo economicus, this approach would not directly raise the issue of growth. The fundamental principle of a market balance, with Walras, reached when supply is equal to demand, did not specify whether or not this balance could be delayed indefinitely due to permanent growth in demand. At the same time, Alfred Marshall also revised Ricardo's law on declining return. At the same time, this law also applied to agriculture, whereas economists at the end of the 19th century focused on industry. Marshall noted the possibility of increasing yield in companies, but there was a point where that yield would decline, the law of non-proportional return. At the same time, the theoreticians of economic cycles would deal with growth in a paradoxical fashion, since you talk about shifts in phases of growth and decline that could be superimposed on a long-term periods. We have Gibbons, for example, who tried to explain economic cycles with the effect of sunspots on yield in fields. We're not far from current debate on the origin of climatic change. But overall, the entire neoclassic economy is built on the implicit hypothesis of growing economies. From 1920 to 1945, principles in previous centuries were called into question, as well as the socialist models. The economic crises led to fears of a halt in growth. Schumpeter feared a loss of a spirit of innovation in a society that would be becoming more bureaucratic already. John Maynard Keynes proposed a method of steering national economies, first intended to restore full employment, which was called into question due to the crisis between the two wars, although Keynes refused to interest in the long term, showing interest therefore in the role that he allocated to investment isn't far de facto from a growth theory. After the Second World War, things changed. The American economy had to be reconverted. In Europe, it was about rebuilding modern economies. So a race for growth was launched. Simon Kuznets had defined a measurement tool, the GDP, which is still the #1 reference in this field. Growth isn't just measured ex post, it is planned, and not only in socialist economies. Everywhere, as of the 50s and 60s, national economic models were developed. One output would be the growth in GDP. In France, for example, this was known as 5-5. These models only work in the short or medium term, a few years, and their national character made them less and less effective in increasingly global economies. The afterwar period also shows another turning point, the discovery of the rest of the world, these new countries that would emerge from decolonization. This third world for Alfred Sauvy and François Pérou, which would be added to the already developed capitalist world and the vast socialist sector with the Soviet Union and China. With Gunnar Myrdal, you can be surprised at the lack of interest so far in these countries and their economies. In his work entitled Asian Drama, an inquiry into the poverty of nations in 1968, he wrote, "There's a surprising lack of interest for colonialism amongst economists. The matter as to whether or not colonies were a real economic benefit or not is still open. Another question should surprise historians. How can the colonizing countries so happily take charge of the moral responsibility of the destiny of millions and hundreds of millions of persons who were suffering on the other side of the ocean? A good question, and still a pending issue. Of course, researchers showed an interest before the Second World War, but according to Myrdal, these were anthropologists sent by rich countries with a static vision of the societies, institutions, and cultural practices they discovered, and that they considered as not able to evolve. Nevertheless, these new countries were new economies, and the only possible destiny was for their economies to grow. In 1968, the population bomb therefore burst in a world where neither to the west, east, or south we were prepared to the idea that there were limits to growth. How was this debate organized? Meadows and Forrester, in their work, The Limits to Growth, published in 1972, also known as the Rome Club Report, that was focused on and criticized. It is based on a model using the dynamic of systems developed at the MIT by J. Forrester, presented the year before in his work called World Dynamics. Going well beyond the national economic models and the different econometrics, at the time, the work proposed for the first time a global model taking into account so far overlooked dimensions, such as the impact of pollution and possible constraints on resources. The model was immediately a big success and received lots of criticisms, especially by the economists from the Coles Foundation, William Nordhaus, in an article entitled World Dynamics, Measurement Without Data. He challenges the fact that these economic assumptions, the lack of validation on empirical data, the lack of retroaction by markets, and the fact that technical progress is not sufficiently taken into account. What were the essential variables in the model? 5. Food resources, drawn from the stock of land available and farm productivity, natural resources, oil, coal, metals, extracted from available reserves, industrial production, and trends in production capital, the level of pollution and its consequences on the environment, and lastly, the world's population. No variable was preferred in the model. they all interacted. Pollution, for example, would act on the population due to the mortality rate, but it is also a function of the total population. There are other intermediary variables, about 80, all interconnected through causal links. The effects may be delayed sometimes. The benefits of health services to reduce mortality aren't felt before several years, for example. The model manages all of these interactions using the system dynamics model. In the sub-model on demographics, for example, mortality depends on the level of food resources, pollution, the overpopulation already attained, and efforts made in health care. Fecundity depends on the number of children desired, which also depends on the life expectancy and standard of living. Effectiveness of contraception, which depends on the activity in the services sector for making contraception available. The population, therefore, would also have an impact on other variables, such as the working population, the extent of pollution, or available production per capita. Thus presented, the model may seems to take into account many key variables. The problem is that the various relations were not described in the work. Not a single relation or variable was drawn from observed data or empirical studies, says Nordhaus ferociously, even though they ensure the function of the model. And we can doubt our capacity, even today, to express expressions due to a simple equation. Who can, for example, connect mortality to pollution? We can say that the Rome Club model contained certain resources. 3 of the variables were subject to absolute limits: food resources, natural resources, and industrial production. But the only variable with an exponential growth that was not controlled was world population. The system was therefore very explosive, like Malthus has said 150 years earlier. The model, well, the authors continued to develop it. There's a version in 2000 developed for this model. No one ever has since tried to develop such a global method. We focus on models with population, economy, climate, and population, 2 variables. In France, for example, Jacques Leçon at the OECD led the Interfutures project, examining variance in possible growth, ensuring a balance between North and South. We also had the DICE model on relations between the economy and climate. At least the Rome Club model draw attention to variables that are now part and parcel of the sustainable development concept, except for one: the possibility of climatic change. Today, scenarios on the possible consequences of global heating treat demographics as being exogenous. The growth in the population would contribute to the increase in the production of CO2. The impact would only be viewed in terms of migrations, with desertification, for example. I won't draw up a list of all the past work or current work on the possibility of global warming. Among economists, the most recent report, the very complete Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change in 2006, has a pessimist diagnosis, while pointing out that the costs that would make it possible to avoid serious long-term damage would be far lower than the cost of the damages themselves. In this type of work, it clearly depends on how up-to-date this is. It's all about choosing between a revenue available immediately or in X years. The existence of a true financial product market gives a concrete, immediate meaning to the present value. How can we estimate the value of a drawback that would actually be borne or supported collectively by future generations, especially if you imagine that due to economic growth, these generations would certainly be richer than current generations? To do so, we'll have to take into account the pure preference for the present, as we can see in the current generation. All things being equal, that would mean reducing the well-being of future generations. You're not interested in the same way in the fate of your own children or the generation that will be there in 100 years or 1,000 years, even though this attitude may be exacerbated by selfishness or attenuated by altruism. You must also focus on the relative contribution to well-being for gain in our current standard of living as compared to a similar gain for future generations, let's say 1%. Now, at the same time, to assess the value, we must estimate the possible growth in global wealth up to the horizon chosen. Lastly, we should also put into balance improvements in nature, primarily qualitative, for example, the quality of the environment and changes in merchant wealth by anticipating the desirable choices to be made by our descendants. Mission impossible, some would say, who do not wish to open up a box where we could find the economy and ethical considerations. Others have tried, such as Nicolas Stern or here, Roger Guénéry. But if we imagine a discount rate of 2% or rate at 2% estimated at 30, 40, or 50 years, such gaps are considerable. At 3%, you multiply by over 4. You understand the difficulty in weighing very long-term risks today. Another major economic challenge is the replaceability of production factors, especially as regards raw material in energy. A lot of projections in the past overlooked this component, one dimension in technical progress. This is a reproach made against the Meadows-Forrester model. After the drop in coal, not everywhere, and the possible decline in oil, will we be able to set up replacement energies without aggravating environmental problems? Yes, according to the optimists, because it's always been the case in the past, and if we cannot as yet, we can provide for the type of replacement energy. No, according to pessimists, because there will be a time when the cost in energy of access to these resources is such that their exploitation would not be viable economically. The only path would be to make such significant energy savings. That applies to non-renewable fossil resources, but I will come back to that later on. All of these debates, therefore, raise the issue of economic growth. For most economists, it's not an issue, but it's due to the miraculous effect of technical progress, which constantly counterbalances the law of diminishing returns, enabling an apparently unlimited growth. This technological progress plays an essential role in the balanced growth models. As of the 80s, economic theory sought to endogenize the mechanism of growth, showing that technical progress is due to the economic efforts made by improving human capital through better training, by promoting the accumulation and the spread of knowledge, developing public infrastructures, urging companies to multiply the number of patents taken out, and by increasing research expenditure. Oh, yes. But the question of the possible limits to growth isn't only a question put to economists. The state policymakers also were in the forum. The population bomb in 1968 was published, and in Paris at the same time we had a conference organized by UNESCO on the biosphere. And the publication of the Rome Club work in 1972 was organized in Stockholm, where we had the emergence of a new UN program for the environment and the International Group of Experts on the Climate, the IPCC. In 1987, the World Commission for the Environment and Development, that was established earlier by the UN, they issued the famous Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, which is still the reference for the concept of sustainable development. And then we had several major world conferences. The Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, followed up later on in 1997, the Cairo Conference on Population 1994, the Millennium Summit meeting in 2000 in New York, the conference in Johannesburg, the Kyoto Protocol signed in 1997, conferences on urbanization in Vancouver, Istanbul, and on food in Rome, and several others. Although the efficiency of all of these major summit meetings is still to be demonstrated, they do show a growing awareness. It is during these meetings that the notion of sustainable development emerged. It wasn't easy. In 1986, the United Nations proclaimed the right to development, defining it as a global economic, social, cultural, and political process seeking to constantly improve well-being of all populations and all individuals. Constantly improvement. In other words, that doesn't suggest that there can be any limit to growth. In 1987, the Brundtland Report introduced and defined the notion of sustainable development, which after some hesitation is now translated into French as durable development. Here's how it is defined. Sustainable development is a mode of development meeting the needs of today without jeopardizing the ability for future generations to cater to their own needs. You all know this statement. The rest is less well known. It's the same paragraph. Two concepts are inherent to this notion. The concept of needs, and especially essential needs of the most underprivileged, and who should be given the priority, and the idea of limitations that the state of our techniques and our social organization imposes on the ability for the environment to cater to current and future needs. The same document points out that sustainable development is far from demanding the end of economic growth, for the authors, growth and sustainable development are not opposed. A few theoreticians for zero growth, Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen or Herman Daly in the United States, are still the main references. For Georgescu, based on Ludzka's works, once again, and the ecologist Howard Oldham, he says it is very important to note that the law of entropy is at the root of economic scarcity. According to this author, I quote, in terms of entropy, the cost of any biological or economic endeavor is always greater than the product, and therefore an unavoidable deterioration of the global system. Energy obtained from coal cannot be changed back to coal, and by burning the coal, you have increased the entropy affecting the earth. In this area, even the principle of replacement cannot be used as an argument in favor of continuous growth. This goes beyond the idea, since it calls into question the very principle of economic growth. And therefore, it claims that the notion of sustainable development accepts the idea of economic growth, better controlled, for example, taking into account the environment. For these advocates, a really sustainable development is quite simply incompatible with any form of economic growth. Only a declining growth can reasonably be contemplated. You should note about the entropy that if you look at the Earth in its globality, there's one energy that will last, the sun. And one day it may be at the heart of our energy production without reducing the Earth's global entropy. We can therefore be less pessimistic, at least in that respect. The notion of sustainable development is attacked on both sides. On the one hand, it will be a hindrance for development of society, especially the least advanced societies, and on the other hand, it's just a clever way of making an indefinite economic growth presentable. And what about demographic growth? The alarm in the 1970s led to the launching of family planning programs, sometimes linked to development plan programs, sometimes subject to prerequisites for aid from international bodies. Some voices were raised to point out that demographic growth is not just a drawback. Esther Bosserup defended the idea that in the relation between population growth and farm resources, the population can really be an incentive. Julian Simon insists on a better division of labor, facilitation of structural adjustments, and pressure Once again, with a bigger or growing population and therefore a younger structure. Empirical observations have shown very little correlation between demographics and GDP per capita. The relation is therefore very complex. But the discussion on overpopulation is not really meaningful today. On the one hand, the 6.6 billion inhabitants are here. It is more urgent to feed them and to give them a decent living rather than to try to determine if they're too numerous or not. On the other hand, as we have seen, the decline in fecundity is well in progress. The average number of children per woman has moved from 5 to 2.7 in just 40 years, whereas the replacement level of generations would be at 2.2. In other words, 80% of the way has already been covered, and the threshold of 2.2 may be attained as of 2030. We don't see how it's possible to go much faster, even if some African countries still have very high growth rates, maybe still too high. You must also say that in many industrialized countries, there are now fears of a decline in demographics, meaning that the debate on a too high a growth rate is inapplicable. The majority of developed countries experience fast growth between the start of the 19th and the middle of the 20th century, at a time when growth was still weak in other countries. And therefore, their portion has almost doubled in the global population. This progression has now been cancelled, and most of these developed countries will decline due to a lower fecundity than the world average. This will apply mainly for Europe, where the population of some countries is already declining. In Germany, a good portion of Central and Eastern European countries, the Baltic states, Russia, and other countries where it's maintained only thanks to immigration, Greece, Italy, and Portugal. Major sociological changes have been in progress in these countries over the past years, 30 years in the West and 15 years in the East, and the change in fecundity has been generated. We could read on the walls of Sciences Po, you don't fall in love with a growth rate, as was said in May 1968. We're not far from that today. Our societies seem to be reaching a strong economic growth, not only an increasing well-being and a solution to problems with employment, but also an automatic reduction in social inequalities. We know that growth has not led to a reduction in developed countries or in other countries over the past decades. Our country, according to the FAO, still has almost 1 billion poor. Now, we also need to agree on the content of growth. The GDP isn't perfectly well suited given the current situation. But what about an extensive or restrictive version of sustainable development? Regardless, clearly our societies must adjust to new constraints. We must modify our eating habits, our consumption habits, especially in energy and in diet, drastically reduce the levels of pollution and so on. I didn't have the time nor the ambition in this lesson to describe the various dimensions of sustainable development. I would have had to speak more about the climate, energy, and food. This will be taught in the coming years through this chair, and we'll talk about it at the International Symposium to be organized in June. For this year, we'll therefore stop at questions regarding the population, and in the coming weeks, I'll focus on the assumptions and limits of the demographic shift, models and methods, and the quality of demographic projections, and the specific problems facing more developed countries, as I said earlier. One can wonder if a reduction in reproductive capacities would not lead to a decline in observed fecundity, a topic I've been very much interested in recent years. Lastly, unless you think in terms of what is known as deep ecology, where man is just one species amongst others without any special rights on earth, but with an exaggerated power of being a nuisance, we must consider that man stands at the heart of all our problems. It's often said that the economy is there to satisfy man's needs and not the opposite. Development must be sustainable to enable future generations to live reasonably on our earth, and not to bring the earth to a state of an undefinable and utopian nature. Condorcet said, once again quoting Condorcet, in just a few words he summarized the ethical principle of sustainable development and the unavoidable demographic constraint. Once again, evoking the assumption of a possible limit to world demographics with a ceiling, he wrote in 1793. But if we were to suppose that this should come about, it wouldn't be terrible for the happiness of mankind, because men would then know that although they have obligations to those who are not born as yet, but it's not about giving them existence, but giving them happiness. I thank you for your attention.